Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. Thank you for inviting me here today to speak about engagement in the context of hostility and more broadly the concept of justice. Thank you to the organisers, particularly Peter and Anna, my fellow speakers, Dr. David Neal, but also thank you very much for turning up today on a very cold morning to come and listen to us speak. It is fitting that before I begin to speak about justice, that I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to ancestors both past and present. I acknowledge the first and most profound act of injustice in Australia, which is the taking of Indigenous land without consent and with violence. There were frontline wars, there were sexual exploitations and beheadings. This country was not just Bush in 1788, and this country was not settled. It was invaded. The British dumped their poor, their needy, and their unwanted, and now we deny others who are poor, needy, and unwanted. I grew up in a rural Indigenous town in northwestern New South Wales in Kamilaroi country, and my parents encouraged me to learn the local history from the Aboriginal elders. So it was at the start of my teenage years that I had a glimpse into the fatal consequences of institutionalised racism on individuals, families, and communities, on how the rule of law can either slice through injustice or merely cloak it in acceptability, legitimising inequality and maintaining the status quo. In 1987, the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission issued a report on the Aboriginal mission called Tumala, which is 15 minutes from my parents' home. The report detailed raw sewerage pooling in the streets, unemployment at 100%, and a single tap being shared amongst all members of the community. In 2012, it was reported that children were still playing in festering wastewater that was pooling in ruts on the side of the road. In 2013, the situation in Tumala was said to be worse now than what it was 25 years ago. And that was my first taste of how the law and governments can fail to address social issues. How by the time issues are budgetarised, deodorised, politicised, they are ineffective and actually do more harm than good, where being seen to be doing something is more important than what is actually being done. On July 18, 2003, over 12 years ago, a 43-year-old Aboriginal woman went missing. The feeling amongst some members of her community is that the investigation into her disappearance was delayed because there was a belief she had simply run off with a man and that she would come off once the Centrelink payments were deposited into her account. She was found stuffed under a cattle grate, dead. Her case has been referred to the New South Wales Cold Case Justice Squad. 12 years on, there is still no justice for Teresa Binge. My second hard lesson: police have a wide range of discretion in how they charge, when they charge, who they charge, and the manner in which they do it. They are not responsible for justice. 7 June 2014, Rodney Clavell took women hostage in a brothel in Adelaide with the use of firearms. His brother described him as a super-fit, devoted Christian who had come unstuck when he discovered that corruption existed within the correctional services system. For him, being Christian, the law wasn't the law, it was corrupt. Clavell's perceived corruption of the law conflicted with his strong, some might say radical, Christian beliefs and ultimately drove him to an act of violence. The hostage incident ended with his own suicide when Clavell shot himself. While this incident fits the definitions perhaps of terrorism, driven by ideology, use of force with an aim to intimidate or coerce, there was no mention of terrorism. In mid-August 2014, the police raided a property in Pullenvale in southwest Brisbane, where 50 kilos of explosive materials and crudely drawn maps of Sydney and Newcastle were discovered. A subsequent search of a property in Newcastle found a range of chemicals in the house and a nearby shed, including DMDT, which was used in the 2005 London bombings. The perpetrator, Daniel Fing, was arrested. Again, the incident bears the hallmarks of terrorism as defined by Australian law. Again, he was not charged with terrorism-related offences. 16 July 2001, Peter James Knight, an anti-abortion activist, walked into an abortion clinic in East Melbourne, armed with a rifle, and shot dead a security guard, Stephen Gordon Rogers. There were 15 staff members and 26 visitors inside that clinic when he entered. He was later overpowered by staff, arrested, charged and convicted of murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Attacks on abortion clinics is one of the most commonly used tactics of extreme Christian terrorism. Yet again, this attack bears all the hallmarks of terrorism, it ticks all the boxes, and yet again, Knight was not charged with any terrorism-related offences. And Teresa Binger's family still rally for justice every single year on the anniversary of her death. I learned about Charles Perkins, Jim Spiegelman and Das Cassidy, amongst other students from Sydney Uni who in 1965 embarked upon the freedom rides, including to the town where my parents live. They stood up against segregation, racism and the appalling and quite legal conditions that the Aboriginal people endured. The freedom rides were reenacted in 2005 and this year marks 50 years since the original freedom rides took place. Learning about the freedom rides was also my third big lesson. It is individuals who cause real social change, who sacrifice, who go against the grain in their rejection of fear, hostility and suspicion of the other, in their rejection of being complicit in the demonisation of those who perhaps represent a thorn in the side of the privileged powerful. It is individuals who champion justice when they recognise the common humanity in all of us, and in not only those who are being oppressed, but also the oppressors. It is powerful, it is peace-building, it is setting fire to the dog whistle politics, it is courageous. And the last 2 years in this country have been, as some would say, confronting, certainly hostile, and certainly where we all need to be a little bit more courageous. On the 17th of September 2014, we saw counter-terrorism raids and law enforcement agencies working hand in glove with the media, uploading directly to the internet footage of the raids, the screening of feartainment. It was a circus, it was a real-life episode of CSI, it was a theatre of terrorism and counter-terrorism streamed right into our living room. In the 3 weeks following the raids, over 30 attacks against Australian Muslims, the vast majority women, were recorded. Many of these reports were taking place in public with children present. The images of women in Islamic clothing were used in the media, and certain politicians called for the shroud of fundamentalism to be rejected in Australia. There was a heading in a newspaper referring to Muslim women as jihad baby makers. In one heading, they'd managed to reduce Muslim women to both their reproductive capacity to produce children or babies straight out of the womb, capable of jihad. So what a perversion of infancy and motherhood. On the 2nd of October, a decision was made to segregate Muslim women who choose to wear the face covering in our Australian Parliament, the heart of our democracy. The very next day, there were 8 reports where Australian Muslim women, again in public with children present, were attacked. Again, this, alarmingly for me as a mother, was again with children present. 3 male protesters went to the Australian Parliament to protest over the back-down of the burqa decision. One protester was dressed in the uniform of the Ku Klux Klan organisation, and it barely caused any consternation other than a ripple of laughter. There can be no denying that there's a link between the rhetoric and social cohesion. And this obsession with Muslim women includes the incessant politicisation of how we look, how we dress, where we come from, what we eat, and how we raise our children. My body and my clothing should not be politicised by privileged white men, nor should it become a subject of interrogation for privileged white women who themselves enjoy the freedom of what they choose to wear, and rightly so, while simultaneously denying other women the right to do so themselves. Muslim women in this country are being constructed, fabricated, imagined, silenced and shackled to both the coalition's construct of the oppressor and the facilitator of terrorism, the threat, and the oppressed Muslim women. We have been sold to the public as a mere reduction. Muslim women are monolith, united by their positions as both subjects of pity and subjects of fear. So imagine what it's like to look in the mirror at your own reflection and see a face that now provokes fear, mistrust, hatred, and anger. It has been exhausting having to fend off this barrage against my identity. Some days you start to hate yourself for no reason, no matter how colourful your scarf is or how short your beard is. Imagine playing with your children in the park and it hits you again, even your role as a parent is being questioned, that you are now being viewed not as a loving father or mother, but as a facilitator of radicalisation, that your sole purpose is to create disaffected young men and women who are conditioned to thinking violence and sexual slavery is normal. Imagine making dinner for your family, and as you sit down to share your meal, you're reminded that even the food you eat is now being seen as funding terrorism. And now it's recently been announced that there'll be a 6-month inquiry by the Senate Economics Reference Committee, which will cover certification schemes such as kosher foods, organic foods, and halal. But please make no mistake, this is neither about kosher food or organic certification. It's squarely about halal and driven by the incessant anti-Islamic campaign cloaked in a smokescreen of concern for animal welfare, freedom of choice, and public safety. Imagine having to explain to your 4-year-old why mummy was abused, why the man kicked the pram, why the man pushed you to the ground and beat you while ripping off your scarf, or why hot coffee was thrown in your face, or why were there pigs' heads thrown on the grounds of the mosque. But even more perverse, mummy, why are you crying? Why do we have to stay at home? Why can't we go to the park to play? Why do we have to wait for daddy to get home? It is the unquantifiable damage that is pervasive and most debilitating. It is the fear, the change in your movements, your relationship with yourself, your family, your community, your country. It is the break in the relationship between the community, law enforcement, and government. On December 15, amidst the Christmas lights and chocolate, a gunman took 17 people hostage for 16 hours in Martin Place, resulting in the deaths of Tory Johnson and Katrina Dawson, and the gunman. This lone gunman transformed into a terrorist in the public and political consciousness with the unveiling of a black flag. Some would argue that this is a very similar circumstance to Rodney Clavell. Organically, after the tragedy, Australian women reached out and created the hashtag I'll Ride With You, and this is the most perfect example of the true Australian spirit and value of mateship, of engaging the most visible other in the context of overwhelming hostility. There will always be people and events who seek to divide us as a country, and not all of them stand behind a black flag. Some will stand behind 6 Australian flags and wear very expensive suits. And what can be more devastating in the face of such a coordinated assault than to recognise our common humanity? Because if we do not stand united, we stand vulnerable. No Australian deserves collective punishment for criminal acts they did not commit. No Australian community deserves to be branded insincere, as the PM said when he stated, "I wish Muslims would speak out and I wish they would mean it." No Australian deserves to live in constant fear and dread. This dangerous way of thinking must not be tolerated, because no one benefits when prejudice towards any group is encouraged. Shortly after the Martin Place tragedy, another tragedy unfolded in Paris with Charlie Hebdo. We witnessed the conflation of 2 arguments regarding Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act and freedom of speech. Political actors and social commentators confuse Section 18C as being an obstacle to freedom of speech. The Australian Muslim community most certainly has not been bullied, bludgeoned or terrorised, haven't bullied, bludgeoned or terrorised largely white Anglo-Saxon men in keeping silent on what Muslim women wear, what we eat, halal certification, terrorism, radicalisation, imaginary backlash, or whether Australian Muslim women are permitted to enter Parliament. It is mischievous to assert that the mere existence of Section 18C has halted any criticisms of Australian Muslims. In fact, the opposite is true. Islamophobia is still alive and well under the Section 18C regime, but I would hate to think what it would be like without it. Now, to clarify, Section 18C doesn't protect me or any other Australian Muslim who's discriminated upon religious grounds. However, we oppose any amendments to Section 18C. It would mean that other Australians are then vulnerable to any kind of discrimination. And those who advocate an absolutist position on freedom of speech ought to comprehend what they are arguing for. Surely the absolutists would support the letters written by the Lint Cafe shooters to war widows. They would support the anti-vaccination speaking tour, highlighting the dangers of vaccination from the US by Sherry Tenpenny. They would speak out against the then Immigration Minister Scott Morrison's decision to cancel pickup artist and dating coach Julian Blanc's visa on the basis that his seminars were derogatory towards women. Significantly, they would have opposed the advocating terrorism provision in the Foreign Fighters Bill, which was introduced by our "You Have a Right to Be a Bigot" Attorney General. This provision is so expansive, it could capture legitimate speech and have a chilling effect on public discourse on issues of terrorism, armed conflict and Australia's foreign policy. This is counterproductive. We already have members in our community who are too scared to speak on the issue of terrorism, ISIS or armed conflict. We are telling our youth to shh for fear that the mere mention of the words will raise suspicions. We are answering their questions with silence, muted by the discourse on terrorism and violent extremism that frames Muslims as the omnious other, that they cannot be trusted. And while we stay silent, those who would mean our children harm fill the void with their propaganda. The chilling side effect is that our ability to counter any terrorist narrative or propaganda is severely impacted. And it's hard to generate a discourse in a culture of political dysfunction where our youth, or perhaps everybody, is struggling and yearning for something better. And we have no avenue for participating, we have no room to speak. So if all we take away from the Paris tragedy is to romanticise Charlie Hebdo as a martyr for free speech and allow backdoor state-sanctioned vilification, the rights discourse in this country is in very big trouble. Our rights discourse in this country has fallen so far that we are championing the rights of those who are part of the dominant discourse at the expense of protection of minorities. Now, Muslim women do not play the victim card, as some of us accuse us of doing when we draw attention to sexism or Islamophobia. This accusation is built on the foundations of bigotry, where you see Muslims on only one side of the gun, always the shooter, but never the one shot. And there's an expectation that I must verbally state that I condemn terrorism because, being a Muslim, there's a suspicion that I don't. Australian Muslim women are constantly being viewed through the distorted prism of violence and radicalisation as conduits for terrorism. On the 26th of February 2015, one of Bendigo's own councillors tweeted photographs of female genital mutilations to a supporter of the proposed mosque, stating that, "Oh, we could have this here too. Would you like your fanny sliced off? Yes, I'm opposed to female genital mutilation, child brides, inequality, women beating, all part of Quran. Read it." Now, it sounds like on the surface I have a lot in common with this councillor, yet something tells me that perhaps she's not advocating for the rejection of the suppression of female sexuality or patriarchy or sexual control of women. As a Muslim woman, although I'm used to having my body politicised and up for review, I must say that it exasperates me to have my vagina suddenly up for dissection, debate and critique. This assumption that Muslim women have no sexual rights, that we only exist for the sexual exploitation of our husbands or for our ability to reproduce, has no basis in my religion. Again, there's this systemic failure to recognise each other's humanity. The exploitation of women who are victims of sex trafficking by ISIS is of course barbaric, but so too is the use of these exploited women as poster women for the invasion of their country. Do not be fooled. The barbaric acts perpetuated against women have nothing to do with rights. It's long been promoted as an essential reason as to why Australia needs to participate in wars or as a platform to justify unjust foreign policies. We are being told that there's not enough money to invest in our own country, yet somehow we can fund a war. And if we're really concerned with women's rights, why are we not invading Iran or Saudi Arabia, who's beheaded more people than ISIS, or India or China? Closer to home, why are we not concerned with the rights of women here? Who is responsible for the violent deaths of over 37 women who have died since the beginning of 2015 due to domestic and family violence? We are literally counting the dead. $1.6 billion spent on counter-terrorism measures, and only $50 million has been nominated to tackle the national emergency of domestic and family violence. Funding for community legal centres, those at the coalface of domestic and family violence, their funding's been defunded, refunded, then it's repackaged and then given back and then underfunded. So we can't advance gender equality if our own individual equality is built on the backs of other women. There can't be a monopoly on liberation or freedom. When we're complicit in the politicisation, alienation, marginalisation, demonisation of other women, we are literally laying the bricks of patriarchy. We are doing the dirty work. And everybody is struggling to understand radicalisation. It's poorly defined, widely used, yet it seems everyone has an opinion, informed or not, on it. And I should state I'm not an expert on it either. $1.6 billion, and I'm not aware of $1 going to researching radicalisation. We do know that different pathways and mechanisms of terrorism involvement operate in different ways for different people at different points of time, and perhaps in different contexts. There is a focus, however, on ideological radicalisation, with the implication that radical beliefs are a precursor for terrorism. And yet, the research overwhelmingly demonstrates that this is simply not true. There is no evidence to support religion. Any religion, including Islam, is a main driver to terrorism. In fact, the research does support that people can still hold radical beliefs after abandoning violence, and that conversely, people who commit acts of violence may have never held radical beliefs to begin with. But in this current discourse on terrorism and national security, this rationale does not sit well with us. It does not align with the political agenda that places social harmony of this country at the sacrificial altar of political point scoring, thinly disguised as concern for public safety and broader security. And quite frankly, there's nothing wrong with being a radical. Jesus, Mother Teresa, Abraham Lincoln, Albert Einstein, Gough Whitlam, Ada Evans were at all one stage considered radicals. Radicals contribute to our society, whether it be in politics, literature, or the arts, although with Brandis now having some of the arts funding, I don't think we're going to see any radical artists emerging anytime soon. And we forget that being radical is not necessarily a bad thing, but being violent obviously is. We should focus on countering violent extremism and not radicalisation. Our own Doc Evatt was a radical, and he was instrumental in Australia being a founding member of the United Nations and the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But how far has Australia fallen? We openly flaunt and disregard our obligations under international law. We support state-sanctioned violence under the guise of humanitarian missions with military elements, where the use of drones have sanitised our reality of war, where as long as the body bags are not returning on Australian soil, the violence is legitimised. Our government asks our men and women to engage in war, and the minister can't even tell us the name of the leader of Daesh. Australia hasn't evolved, like other countries in the Western world, to pass a war powers bill, which would effectively give the Australian public some say whether we should go back or into war. We engage in illegal wars like Iraq. We aid in the slaughtering of close to 1 million people. We destroy a country. We create the perfect breeding grounds for terrorism. We support and counter our closest allies, the despots, autocrats, and oppressive regimes which crack down on any uprising demanding democracy, or any uprising that demands that human rights are honoured or that humanity is recognised or respected. And we turn a blind eye to torture. We don't even have a Bill of Rights. We criminalise whistleblowing, one of the hallmarks of a healthy democracy. We pass legislation which could allow the targeted killings of Australians overseas. We pass metadata laws, which is effectively mass surveillance on every single Australian, including people sitting here in the audience, most certainly me, I can guarantee it. We're in danger of abdicating our responsibilities of what it means to live in a democracy to the very leaders who are systematically disregarding, manipulating, fabricating, reinterpreting, or basically ignoring our civil liberties and human rights. We've been sold a false paradigm that tells us if we sacrifice our civil liberties and if we breach our human rights obligations, then we will achieve security. This is an illusion. Even at the highest assessment of 200 foreign fighters, this equates to 0.001% of the Australian population. But there's no national debate. It's extremely superficial, the conversations that we do have, and there's no nuance. There's no sharp analysis. The rhetoric and the language being used to shape the debate around issues of peace, human rights, national security, and radicalisation is changing the very fabric of our society and the character of our country. The suite of terrorism laws passed last year never demonstrated that they were proportionate to a threat, that the current laws were insufficient, and the time that was given to understand these laws and to determine their impact was minimal at best. Resolving conflicts, ending foreign occupations, overcoming oppression, eradicating poverty, supporting sustainable development, defending human rights, promoting good governance, all are vital to the struggle against terrorism. Yet addressing these challenges is made much more difficult by the politicised discourse of counter-terrorism. And can I say, that is the most effective counter-narrative to terrorism, to combating terrorism. What we do know is the Australian government has heavily invested in reactive strategies such as investing in law enforcement and security intelligence, which is actually bucking the international norm. We do know that radicalisation is still being viewed through a religious and racial lens. We do know that the rising right in this country, which ASIO has indicated we have a right to be concerned about, or grounds to be concerned about, are totally outside the spotlight. The rising right is fixated on Muslims as society's new reds under the bed. It represents deep-seated anxieties about control, displaced onto an Islam that has come to represent symbolically a sense of traditional loss and struggle in a changing global and multicultural world. And people are not radicalised merely by watching a YouTube video. By the time they're looking at that stuff, the damage has already been done. The young men going over to fight, not all of them are uneducated, mentally ill and unsophisticated misfits. They are not being groomed online by pedophile-like rings from IS that some people would like us to believe. Such answers are really simplistic. They don't take into account the myriad of factors that are implicated in radicalisation to violent extremism. But we believe them because they fit nicely with our own historically inherited stereotype of the angry Muslim and the oppressed Muslim woman. They fit perfectly into our political discourse of national security. They allow us literally to walk away from our responsibilities as a nation and instead blame those bloody Muslims. Even worse, they restrict our ability to respond in meaningful ways. So for more than 4 decades, researchers have tried to come up with a terrorist profile and they've failed. There is widespread acceptance that there is simply no single profile of who becomes a violent extremist and why. Ask any academic in this field and they will tell you that any notion of a terrorist profile has been debunked. Yet here in Australia, we have so-called indicators of radicalisation now being used to train law enforcement and government workers on how to spot a radical. Radicalisation simply cannot be reduced to an arbitrary list of checkboxes. It just can't. Can't be randomly detected by changes in appearance or even behaviour. And still, our insistence is on an oversimplification of a complex issue causes surprise when good Muslims from stable homes join IS and their parents are completely oblivious. So my question is, if parents can't detect it, how on earth can Mr. Jones or Mr. Barton think that they can? Islamophobia and radicalisation are two sides of the same coin. If Islamophobia and right-wing extremism is allowed to fester unchecked, it will result in further alienation and marginalisation of those who are already at risk of radicalisation. It's like a formula. It is counterproductive and it reinforces ISIS propaganda that the West is evil, you will never belong, look what we can offer you. So thank you to Reclaim Australia, the Q Society, Combat 18, the Australian Defence League and to Stop the Mosque movement in Bendigo for contributing to the pervasive slick propaganda machine of ISIS. Well done, and please note my tone of sarcasm. Now, the interesting aspect of all the Stop the Mosque campaigns across Australia is it reveals how simple acts of worship like praying is now being viewed through this prism of savage acts and violence, of orange jumpsuits and masked men. Liberalism is not the only theory in the entire universe that believes that murdering people, that slicing their throats or setting people on fire is wrong. Liberalism does not hold a monopoly on determining what is right and wrong. The world today does not afford us the luxury of time to continue to exploit fellow Australians for short-term political gain. What this country needs is not division, it is unity. It is not humiliation, but compassion. It is not violence, but peace. It is not injustice, but justice. And after every video that ISIS releases, the most predictable response is outrage, followed by promises of tougher action, which means more police powers, more penalties, and more sentences. This is a political choice that cements the status quo without encouraging dissent or debate, without generating any other options. Largely, engagement with law enforcement agencies are still conducted at the end of the baton, and there's still not just mistrust, but an absolute breakdown in relationships and partnerships. As female Muslim advocates, when we promote peace, civil liberties and human rights, we pay our pound of flesh in death threats, online abuse, offensive pornography sent to our work addresses, the smear campaign, the destruction of our property. We have fights with our partners who see how tired we are, how thin we are stretched, but who know that we cannot stop in our advocacy in the face of hostility, because we, the women, know our role in playing and combating hate and racism, in addressing extremism, in promoting political participation, inclusion and engagement. So yes, for the record, we do mean it when we say it. And we say it knowing that it has very real life consequences. We say it without the flags behind us, without the comm cars, without the security, certainly without the salary, and also without the advisors. So in the cult of individualism, where we're all more concerned about Kim Kardashian's selfies than what we are of being of service, where we debate ideological differences at the expense of supporting the democratic good, we are failing, absolutely and miserably failing, to recognise and respect our common humanity. And it is this principle, and not the law, which acts as the civilising cement that holds our country together. And if you love your country and you see it stumbling drunk in the dark towards a bleak future, you speak up, even on issues that are very deeply unpopular with the Australian public. My question to you is, where is our moral compass and why are we afraid to use it? Why is it a surprise that our democratic spirit is struggling? Our dysfunctional political leadership is not the answer to peace building or social engagement. It is people like you in the audience who are responsible for engaging, reimagining and laying the bricks hand by hand of a civil society, of bringing injustices to the surface and continuing to advocate in a context of hostility. Thank you.